I'm going to share a story from my first day at a new high school in a small town that my family just moved to. I was nervous but excited to make a new start, leave behind my new kid tag, and hopefully, make some new friends. Little did I know, my first day at Westwood High would be anything but ordinary. As I walked up to the school that morning, there was this strange quietness, almost too quiet for comfort. My footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, which were dimly lit and looked like they hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. I passed by flickering lights that made the shadows dance along the walls. It was like the school itself was watching me. Just then, I bumped into the janitor polishing a trophy case filled with awards that looked way too old. He was an older guy, with a friendly smile, but there was something odd about the way he looked at me. As he wiped the glass, he said in a low tone, "Watch the shadows, they whisper here." Then he just walked away. I chuckled nervously, thinking it was some kind of weird joke. My first class was English with Mrs. Calloway. She was very enthusiastic, especially when she saw me. "Justin, right? You remind me so much of a student I had years ago." Her comment sent a chill down my spine, especially the way she stared a bit too long. The rest of the class was dead silent, watching me like I was a ghost or something. During a break, I stumbled upon a narrow door under the staircase, leading down to the basement. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sneaked down. The air was musty, and old portraits of students who looked eerily like some of my classmates lined the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I found newspapers clipping about various school events, but some were reports of students who had mysteriously vanished over the years. Lunchtime wasn't any better. I sat by myself, trying not to feel too awkward. I couldn't help but overhear bits of conversations around me, kids whispering about a curse and how new students always disappear. I tried to laugh it off, but the way they were talking made it hard to swallow my food. Then, the lights flickered and shut off completely for a few seconds before coming back on. I looked up and found everyone staring at me, their eyes wide and faces pale. It was as if they saw something behind me. I turned around quickly but saw nothing. My heart was racing now, and not just from being the center of attention. That's when Emily came over. She was about my age, with a serious look on her face. "You need to get out of here, Justin," she whispered urgently. "It's not safe for you. Today marks the anniversary of the last new kid who disappeared." My head started spinning, not just from what Emily was saying but also because I suddenly felt really dizzy. I remembered the janitor was near my locker earlier. Had he done something to my water bottle? Panic set in, and everything around me started to blur. As the final bell rang, I packed up my things and rushed to the main exit, only to find it locked. I turned around and there was the janitor, blocking my way with that same unsettling smile. "You can't leave, Justin. You never will," he said, his voice no longer friendly but menacing. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to get out. I remembered Emily mentioning an old gym that was rarely used. I made a break for it, dodging classmates who now seemed more like shadows than people. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down forgotten hallways, the echoes of my footsteps my only company. Finally, I pushed through an old rusted door that led outside. I didn't stop running until I reached my house. When I looked back, I could see figures standing at the school windows, just watching. Back home, I tried to tell my parents about what happened, but it sounded so crazy. That night, as I lay in bed trying to convince myself it was all some weird prank, I got a notification on my phone. A friend request from Emily. But when I clicked on her profile, my blood ran cold. Her profile said she had been missing since last year, the same girl who supposedly disappeared from Westwood High. And that's my story. My first and last day at that school. I still don't have all the answers, but I know I'm not going back there. Ever. Lying in my bed that night, I kept replaying everything in my head. The janitor's cryptic warnings, the cold stares of my classmates, and the chilling finality in Emily's voice. It all seemed like a bad dream, but the friend request from a missing girl was undeniably real. I wondered if I had seen signs that I should have noticed sooner. Was there something about the school's silence that morning that was a warning? Why did no one talk about the disappearances openly? It felt like the whole town was in on a secret that only the new kids learned too late. The next morning, I received a message from Emily. It read, "Thank you for listening to me. Keep asking questions." It was vague, but it felt like a nudge to keep digging into the school's mysterious past. Despite my fear, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I started researching online, looking through old news archives and social media for any clue about what was really happening at Westwood High. I found forums filled with theories and stories from other former students who had similar eerie experiences. None as drastic as disappearance, but enough to confirm there was something wrong with that place. It wasn't just superstition, something dark was at the heart of that school. As days passed, I became more determined to uncover the truth. My parents noticed my growing obsession and worried about my safety, but I felt driven by a need to expose whatever was hidden within those walls. I planned to meet with a local journalist who had written about the school's unexplained incidents years ago. This meeting, however, would never happen. The journalist canceled last minute, messaging me to stay away from the school story. The warning was clear and chillingly familiar. It seemed that even those who dared to speak up were silenced in one way or another. My experience at Westwood High has left me with more questions than answers, but it's taught me that some places hold secrets too dangerous to chase. I've made peace with not knowing everything, but I'll always be alert, always questioning the shadows around me. Maybe one day, the truth will come out. When I think back on my childhood, there are days that stand out as particularly bright or incredibly dark. But none are as dark or as vivid as my first day at Crestwood Middle School. I was the new kid, and that alone should have been daunting enough. But there was something else, a chill that went beyond the usual first day jitters. As I walked through those massive, imposing doors, the school loomed like a giant, its hallways sprawling like veins. I remember feeling tiny, lost in the vastness. The faces of other students blurred past, some curious, most indifferent. It was Mr. Thomas, the assistant principal, who first greeted me. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with a warm smile that, somehow, didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, piercing and calculating, seemed to size me up with a glance. Mr. Thomas took it upon himself to show me around the school. His voice was smooth, almost too perfect. "You'll like it here, Dan," he assured me as we walked. We toured classrooms, the library, the cafeteria, each place bustling with the chaos of a school day. But it was what he said next, as we passed a nondescript, locked door, that caught my attention. "That area is off limits," he said sternly, a sudden edge to his voice. "For your safety, stay away from there." He didn't explain further, and his tone suggested it wasn't up for discussion. Throughout the day, the forbidden area became the centerpiece of whispered legends among the students. Some said it was haunted, others spoke of strange experiments. They talked about a student who had disappeared last year, about eerie noises that echoed through nearby vents. It was all too thrilling, too sinister to ignore. Lunchtime brought no relief. I sat alone, my thoughts swirling with rumors and warnings. That's when I saw something that chilled me to the bone. A group of older students cornered a younger one not far from where I sat. Their leader, a tall boy with a menacing look, hissed, "Don't even think about going near there. You know what happened to the last one who tried." The younger boy's eyes widened with fear before he nodded, scrambling away as soon as they released him. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I made up my mind. I had to see the forbidden area for myself. The final bell rang, and instead of heading out to the buses like everyone else, I hid behind a row of lockers until the coast was clear. The corridors were eerily silent as I made my way toward the forbidden wing. My heart pounded with every step I took down the less traveled hallway. The air grew colder, the atmosphere heavier. I was close now, I could feel it. Suddenly, I heard it, a low moan, like the building itself was groaning. I froze, listening as it grew louder, then turned into whispers. What were they? My resolve faltered. I thought about turning back, but my feet moved of their own accord, pulling me closer to the source of the sounds. As I approached the locked door, the whispers became clearer. They were voices, desperate and chilling. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. This was wrong. All of this was very wrong. That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat, to find Mr. Thomas standing there, his expression no longer warm, but cold and dark. I warned you, Dan, he said, his voice dripping with a threat that made my stomach churn. Curiosity can be dangerous. His eyes glinted with something wicked, something delighted in my fear. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run. He was right behind me, his footsteps echoing ominously through the hallways. I darted through doors, downstairs, my breath ragged, my mind screaming for escape. I could hear him laughing now, a sound that seemed to chase me faster than he could. Somehow, I made it out of the building and didn't stop running until I reached the street, where I almost collided with a group of students. They stared at me, shocked at my appearance, pale, shaking, a wild look in my eyes. The aftermath was a blur. I told my parents, who contacted the school board. Investigations were launched. It turned out Mr. Thomas had been part of something sinister, something that the forbidden area hid from prying eyes. He was dismissed, but the shadows he cast on my life never quite faded. Years later, I understand now more than ever how some scars remain, etched deep into who we are. That day taught me more about the world's darker corners than any class could. It showed me that sometimes, the faces we trust most hide the darkest intentions. And I learned that fear, once it takes root, can last a lifetime. This story, a tale of my first day at a place that was meant to be a haven of learning, serves as a chilling reminder that the most menacing dangers often lurk beneath a veneer of authority and safety. As an adult, I've revisited that school a few times, now just an observer, no longer a participant in its daily dramas. The building looks less imposing, the hallways less labyrinthine, but the memory of that day remains as vivid and terrifying as ever. I was just 11, starting 6th grade at a new school, and if you asked me then, I'd have told you I was more excited than nervous. Little did I know, that day would teach me a lesson I'd carry for the rest of my life. Trust is a luxury sometimes you can't afford. The school, an old brick building with vines crawling up its sides, had seen better days. It buzzed with the energy of students who, like me, were trying to find their place. I remember trying to blend in, swapping stories with classmates about summer adventures. But no matter how normal everything seemed, there was this odd feeling I couldn't shake off, like I was watching me from just out of sight. During recess, I noticed him for the first time. A man, oddly out of place, stood near the edge of the playground, staring. His eyes had a cold, piercing quality that made my stomach churn. I figured he was just a parent, maybe new to the school like me, and shrugged it off. The bell rang, pulling my attention away, back to the safety of my classroom. As the final bell rang and the corridors filled with the sounds of kids rushing for freedom, I decided to take the scenic route home. My house wasn't far, and I loved walking. But as I left the school gates, there he was again, that same man, now seemingly waiting. A chill ran down my spine. He was no parent. His clothes were too ragged, his gaze too intense. And he was looking right at me. Picking up my pace, I told myself I was just being paranoid. But every block I passed, I saw him trailing behind, keeping his distance but always there. Panic gripped me. I started taking random turns, even doubling back at one point, but nothing shook him. Suddenly, the sky darkened as if sensing my fear, and a cold wind whipped around, carrying whispers of threats in its gusts. I felt isolated, every shadow seemed to hide lurking dangers. That's when Mr. Thompson, the father of a classmate, drove by. He slowed down, rolled down his window, and offered me a ride. Relief washed over me as I climbed into the car, grateful to escape my follower. Mr. Thompson asked about my first day, his voice calm, but there was something odd about his questions, something that made my relief start to curdle into suspicion. As we drove, I noticed personal items in the car that didn't belong to Mr. Thompson or his family, like a worn-out jacket that looked just like the one the following man had worn. My heart sank. The car's air felt thick, heavy, as if every breath was harder to draw. Mr. Thompson was no rescuer. He was in league with the man who had been following me. Thinking quickly, I told him I just remembered my mom needed me home straight away and asked him to drop me off at the corner near the school. As soon as the car stopped, I didn't wait for him to unlock the door. I unlocked it myself, bolted out, and ran as fast as my legs could carry me, not stopping until I saw the familiar faces of my teachers and the safety of the school grounds. The school called the police, and it turned out I was right. Mr. Thompson and a strange man were part of a scheme targeting kids from my school. They'd been planning it for weeks, and I was their first potential victim. That day, I learned a hard lesson about the dangers that can lurk in plain sight. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and I never ignored that gut feeling again. So, let this be a reminder, a lesson to all who hear this story. Be watchful, be wary, and remember, not everyone who offers you help is a friend. Sometimes, the most dangerous people wear the mask of kindness, waiting for you to let your guard down. And remember, real life can be scarier than any ghost story because the monsters can be hiding where you least expect them.